Daniel Beckett had waited 30 years for silence. After a career in manufacturing and a lifetime of urban traffic, arguments over parking spaces, and the slow creep of neighbors too close to his windows, he'd finally earned his place in the hills. His ranch, 30 acres of wild prairie grass, stubborn mesquite, and oak-lined trails, sat 10 miles from the nearest town. No sidewalks, no mailboxes in neat little rows, just dirt, weather, and freedom. It was the kind of land where you could stand outside and hear nothing but the wind brushing past the grass. And that's exactly why the tire tracks bothered him. They weren't from his truck. Daniel knew every inch of his path from the main road to the barn, every groove, every curve. These were fresh, and they came through the main gate. He hadn't had deliveries. No one called. No neighbors had reason to stop by. There wasn't even a reason to be near his property without turning onto his gravel lane. He knelt beside the tracks just before sunrise. Something light, maybe a crossover. Small tires. Shallow tread. They led right past the gate and ended near the south paddock. His instincts told him to check the barn camera. He wasn't a paranoid man by nature, but being alone out there, so far from anyone, you learn to trust unease when it settled into your gut. His old trail cam, mounted under the barn eaves, had a low frame rate, but a decent motion trigger. Daniel plugged the SD card into his laptop and scrolled back. One clip jumped out from the night before. A car, white or silver, pulled up at 5:42 a.m. Headlights flared for just a moment before cutting off. The camera caught the silhouette of a woman stepping out, her hair tied up, phone in hand. She moved with the confidence of someone who felt entitled to be there. She didn't sneak. She recorded the barn, the gate, the fencing around the cattle, pens. She walked the property like she had a clipboard in her mind. Daniel's brow furrowed. He didn't recognize her. She wasn't a neighbor from the old ranching families. Those folks wouldn't pull stunts like this anyway. They'd just walk up and knock. The next day, round noon, Daniel spotted her again. This time, she was standing by his barn like she was waiting for someone, arms crossed, tapping her foot. Her SUV, a shiny late model Lexus, was parked off the road, tires half on the gravel, half on his grass. Daniel parked his truck between her and the barn. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked up and introduced herself with a practiced smile. "Hi there. I'm Karen Langley. I'm with the neighborhood committee. We're just doing a quick check-in on compliance structures and environmental risks. Standard stuff." Daniel blinked. "Committee?" he asked. She nodded like it was obvious. "The HOA. Didn't you get the letter?" He looked out across the hills, where nothing stood except oak trees and sky. "I don't belong to an HOA, he said. She tilted her head, offering that sympathetic look people give when they think you're misinformed. "Well, some of the local zones were absorbed during the expansion phase. It's a new process. Just a formality." Daniel didn't say anything. Karen pulled out her phone and started typing. "I'll make a note that you're not yet registered," she said as she walked back to her vehicle. Daniel stood there, watching her tires spit up gravel. Something about her tone, her certainty, made his jaw tighten. He didn't know what kind of trouble she planned, but it was coming. He could feel it. 2 mornings after the woman's visit, Daniel found an envelope tucked under the corner of his welcome mat. No stamp, no logo, no address. Just a plain white envelope sealed with a triangle of tape. Inside was a printed letter that looked like it had been run off a home office printer. It began with "Dear property occupant," and the rest was a list of violations: unauthorized agricultural structures, non-standard fencing height, visual disruption due to unmanaged livestock areas. There was no signature, no contact number. And no hoa seal, just a date at the bottom and a vague threat that continued non-compliance will result in progressive enforcement measures. Daniel folded it once and dropped it on the kitchen counter. Then he pulled his boots on and checked the perimeter again. There were no broken locks, but the chain on the side gate had been disturbed. One link sat twisted unnaturally, as if it had been turned by something thin but strong bolt cutters, maybe. The dirt beneath the gate showed a light indentation, not recent. Maybe last night. Later that day, he asked his closest neighbor, Hank Rollins, if he'd seen anything unusual. Hank had lived down the gravel road for 25 years and had the kind of face that stayed unreadable even when he was grinning. When Daniel brought up the envelope, Hank's grin faded. They started on the new Ridge homes, but I figured they'd move this way eventually. Hank said. Daniel asked, who's they? Hank leaned against his old pickup and glanced toward the distant rooftops visible from the ridge. That little neighborhood up the hill. The ones with the identical houses and their own mailboxes. They got tired of dealing with our kind of mess. Made up their own rules. Started calling themselves a committee. Daniel crossed his arms. Can they enforce anything? Hank shook his head. Not legally. But they act like they can. Sent me a letter too. Told me to take down my flagpole. Did you? I added to more flags. That night, Daniel stood on his porch as the last light bled from the sky. His cattle grazed quietly near the fence line, and for a moment, everything felt like it should. Quiet. Still. The land whispering as it cooled. Then a car crept down the road. He didn't recognize it. A small sedan, maybe a Corolla. Lights dimmed, windows tinted. It moved slowly past his driveway, paused just long enough for the silhouette inside to turn its head toward the house, and then rolled forward again without stopping. Daniel narrowed his eyes and stepped off the porch. He walked down to the mailbox, opened it, and checked again. Another envelope. No postage. No name. This one had just 4 words on the single page. Final notice before action. He tore it in half, dropped the pieces in the burn barrel by the shed, and lit a match. If they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. By Thursday, Daniel's boots were caked in dust from walking the fence line 3 times a day. The cameras were running. The new locks were installed. He'd even added a second chain to the main gate, looped in a crisscross pattern, and secured with 2 padlocks, not because he thought it was necessary, but because it made him feel like he was doing something, anything. But the locks didn't stop them. That morning, he woke before dawn to feed the cattle. As he stepped outside, something felt off. The barn door was ajar, not just loose but wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze like someone had forgotten to close it. Daniel froze. His first thought was an animal. But animals don't unlock padlocks. He jogged down to the barn, shotgun in hand, and peered inside. The tool bench had been disturbed. Several bins of feed had been moved. A few fence repair tools, wire cutters, gloves, even his spare radio were missing from the wall. Nothing shattered, nothing ransacked, but everything had been touched. The lock on the barn's side entrance wasn't cut. It was unlocked. He walked slowly to the main gate, expecting to find broken chains or busted latches. But both padlocks were still there, perfectly fastened, hanging just as he'd left them. He didn't understand. And then he remembered the footage back in the house. He pulled the SD card from the barn camera and loaded it on his laptop. The footage was grainy in low light, but the timestamp showed clear movement around 5:11 a.m. A car approached the gate. It stopped. A woman stepped out, flanked by 2 others. One held a flashlight, the other what looked like a clipboard. The third, the leader, approached the gate. Karen, Daniel leaned closer as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a key. She bent down, fitted to one of the padlocks, turned it, and stepped through like she had done it 100 times before. The chain loosened. The gate opened wide enough for them to walk in single file. The camera didn't catch everything, but he saw enough Karen entering his barn, gesturing to the others, pointing at his equipment like she was giving a property tour. They stayed for 7 minutes and left the gate as they found it. Daniel paused the video and stared at the frame, Karen's hand resting on the gate, a smirk faintly visible in the dawn light. He didn't know what burned more, the fact that someone had a key to his gate, or that they weren't afraid to use it. That afternoon, he drove into town to speak with the sheriff's office. The deputy behind the counter was polite, but vague. Without physical damage or theft of high value, it would be hard to charge anyone. He'd need a name, evidence of forced entry, or property loss beyond tools. A known suspect trespassing after being warned. Daniel gave them the footage anyway. When he returned home, another envelope waited at the base of the porch steps. This one was different. It was bright blue and sealed with a foil sticker. Inside was a flyer, printed in color, titled Community Compliance Expectations for Adjacent Properties. In the corner, under a mock logo of a tree and house, sat a single line of text, effective. Cooperation prevents escalation. Daniel crumpled it in one hand. He walked to the gate, stood where Karen had stood, and stared at the padlock. Now it wasn't just about threats. Someone had a key, and they weren't done yet. Today's passed without another envelope. But Daniel didn't mistake silence for peace. Not after what he saw on the footage. He'd been replaying the moment over and over, Karen stepping through his gate, like she had every right. And that smug, familiar look as she left, like it was just another day at the office. Then, on Saturday afternoon, she returned. Daniel was repairing a busted hinge on the shed door when he saw the white Lexus roll slowly up his gravel path. No attempt to honk. No call ahead. Just the sound of tires crunching until she parked near the barn, right where she trespassed before. Karen stepped out with her clipboard again, this time dressed in a gray cardigan and dark slacks like she was headed to a board meeting. She didn't even hesitate to walk across the grass. Daniel stood, hands still greasy from the hinge work. "You're brave showing up again," he said. Karen smiled as if she hadn't heard the edge in his voice. "I'm here to resolve a miscommunication." Daniel didn't move. "You broke into my property." That clear enough. She glanced at the barn. There was no break-in. The gate was accessed with a standardized key, one used by several community enforcement officers during property checks. He blinked. Community what? She took out a paper and handed it to him. "You're in what we call the expansion buffer zone. New boundaries were reviewed at the last informal charter meeting. Your ranch falls within the visual influence perimeter of the Greater Hillside Estates District." Daniel scanned the page. Nothing on it looked official. No government seal. No legal citation. Just phrases like aesthetic integrity and neighborhood cohesion. "So this is your justification for trespassing?" he asked, holding up the paper. "You think you have jurisdiction over my fence line because someone might see my cows from a mile away?" Karen sighed like she'd had this conversation too many times already. "It's not about the cows. It's about order, appearance, safety. You're operating without review, storing heavy equipment in unapproved structures. And you've had open flame barrels near native dry brush. That burn barrel is 50 feet from anything green." "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to inform," she replied, glancing at her clipboard. "We've given 3 written notices. You've ignored them. The next phase involves documentation and forwarding your case to the enforcement subcommittee. Daniel narrowed his eyes. What committee? You just make that up. She looked genuinely offended. No, it's real. And if you continue to obstruct, things will escalate. People, like order, Mr. Beckett, they moved here to escape chaos. If your property continues to stand out, it threatens market values and public trust in community standards. Daniel stepped closer, voice lower. This isn't your neighborhood. This is my land. My name is on every inch of it. You don't have a say. Karen didn't flinch. She took a slow step back and looked around, like she was measuring the place for something. Well, she said at last, non-compliance is always an option, but it comes with consequences. She turned and walked away. Daniel didn't follow. He stood there as the Lexus pulled back onto the road, the sound of spinning tires rising for a moment before fading into the quiet of the hills. Inside the envelope she left behind, one sentence stood out. Unresolved violations may require external intervention. Daniel crumpled the paper in his hand. Whatever she had planned next, it wasn't going to be more letters. The next night came quiet. Too quiet. Daniel sat in his den, pretending to read a book while the wind pushed softly against the windows. The ranch, usually full of chirping crickets and the occasional coyote call, felt unnaturally still. He hadn't lit the porch lights. He wanted it dark. Wanted to see if anything moved where it shouldn't. At 12:43 a.m., the motion sensor behind the equipment shed sent a ping to his phone. He slipped on his boots, grabbed the old pump-action shotgun from the rack by the door, and stepped outside. He didn't go alone. His son, Jake, was home for the weekend. Jake had arrived that afternoon, unannounced but not unexpected. He was a state trooper who'd grown up fixing fence posts and hauling hay bales on the same ranch. One look at his father's tight expression and the locked gate, and he knew something wasn't right. So when the alert chimed, Jake was already lacing his boots. Camera picked up something back by the shed. Daniel whispered as they stepped out into the moonlit gravel path. Could be raccoons. Jake shook his head. Raccoons don't cut locks. They moved fast but quiet, boots crunching gently as they crossed toward the outbuildings. No lights, no talking, just the creak of the wooden gate as Jake pushed it open with the barrel of his service pistol drawn low. Then they heard it metal tools shifting. A hushed voice. A flashlight beam flickered across the inside wall of the shed. Jake took point, motioning for his father to hang back. He reached the edge of the structure, counted to 3, and stepped into view. There were 3 figures inside. 2 were crouched by the back corner near the fuel drums. The third stood at the workbench, turning over a socket wrench in gloved hands. It was Karen. All 3 froze at the sight of Jake, who said nothing. He didn't need to. He pulled a badge from inside his jacket and held it out toward the flashlight. Karen's eyes widened. You can't. Hands where I can see them, Jake said. The other 2 raised their hands. Karen hesitated, but Jake took a step closer, and she obeyed. Daniel emerged a second later and leaned in the doorway, eyes locked on Karen. Still just a formality, he asked. Karen looked rattled now. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain. It's a compliance inspection. You have dangerous tools stored without permits. Anyone could get hurt. In the middle of the night, Jake snapped. She glanced between the father and son, then said something that made both their jaws clench. We used the key to avoid confrontation. The same contractor who installed this gate system had keys made. It's a known thing. Common access. Daniel stepped forward. That key's for the developer, not for neighbors, not for HOA patrols, and not for you. Karen's confidence, which had seemed invincible days before, had finally faltered. One of the other women stammered. Something about Karen said this was legal. The third stayed silent. Jake began taking notes, names, statements. He called the local sheriff's department and asked for a unit to be sent to the ranch. Karen tried one more time to regain control. "You're blowing this out of proportion. You people act like you're above the community." Jake gave her a hard look. "We're not above it. We're just not part of it." By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, Karen had changed her story twice. First, it was a sanctioned inspection. Then it was just a routine safety sweep. When that didn't stick, she claimed she had verbal permission from community liaisons to access Daniel's property. Jake watched her squirm under the porch light, arms folded, face unreadable. The other two women said almost nothing, staring at the gravel while the deputy collected statements. Daniel didn't say much either. He let the footage speak. The deputy reviewed the motion cam video on Jake's phone. It showed them unlocking the gate, walking into the shed, and poking through private equipment without hesitation. "What you've got here," the deputy finally said, "is unauthorized entry and attempted interference with private property. Could be considered criminal trespass." Karen, still clinging to her composure, insisted she had a right to inspect. She said her group had limited jurisdiction over surrounding properties due to environmental overlap and visual impact. The deputy looked unimpressed. "There's no legal document that gives you any authority here," he said. "And even if there was, it wouldn't be executed at midnight with a borrowed key." That's when Jake pressed further. "Where did you get the key?" Karen hesitated. The deputy repeated the question. She finally muttered, "A friend. From the developer's office. He said he had a universal set. They were used when these gates were first put in years ago." "Name?" the deputy asked. She didn't answer. But that was all Jake needed to hear. After the patrol car drove off, taking one of the women with them on a warrant issue, Jake and Daniel stood under the cold stars and tried to make sense of it. Jake rubbed his jaw. "You know what this means, right?" Daniel nodded. "If she's telling the truth, someone gave her a key that was never supposed to leave the developer's hands, which means others could have it too." They went inside, pulled out the deed paperwork, and started digging. Daniel had never paid much attention to the old boundary files tucked in the original folder yellowed papers signed by his great-uncle back when the land was first split into parcels. Jake scanned one of the documents and looked up slowly. "Dad, this land's exempt?" Daniel blinked. "From what?" Jake held up the paper. "Any residential governing body. See this clause? Parcel designated as heritage agricultural land. No subdivision, no governing board, no zoning authority applies, unless by direct sale to private hoabound estate. Your uncle filed this with the county when he split the ridge." Daniel read the line twice. His property wasn't just outside the HOA's reach. It had been shielded from it before any of those homes existed. Karen's claim was based on nothing. Legally, her entire argument collapsed under that single paragraph. Jake leaned back in the chair. "She's been bluffing the whole time." Daniel walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet hills, remembering the look on Karen's face when she turned that key. How sure she had been. How practiced she wasn't bluffing, he said quietly. She really believed it. Jake tilted his head. "Which makes her more dangerous?" By sunrise, Jake was already on the phone with the county clerk's office. He scheduled an in-person visit and told his father they weren't waiting for this to blow over. If Karen had operated this boldly, others might have followed her lead or, worse, actually believed in her invented authority. The clerk's office sat 2 towns over, in a square brick building where paper still ruled. Inside, behind a smudged window labeled land management and zoning, an older man with thick glasses retrieved the parcel books. After Jake showed him the exemption clause in Daniel's deed, Jake and Daniel sat at a wide wooden table surrounded by folders so old they still smelled of carbon paper. The clerk flipped through records for Hillside Estates, Karen's neighborhood, and pointed to a section with red tabs. She's part of subdivision H12, initially classified as a private, gated community. Charter filed 10 years ago. Very strict codes. But look here. He slid the page closer. They're boxed in. East, west, and south borders are all adjacent to exempt or unrestricted agricultural land. North side was meant for future development, but it never happened. Daniel leaned in. So they're locked in a box with nowhere to grow. Exactly, the clerk said. And if I'm reading this right, the only way they could extend influence outside their lines would be through voluntary annexation. That means homeowners have to agree to be part of the HOA. Jake tapped Daniel's deed. And you never agreed. Not even once, Daniel said. The clerk nodded, clearly familiar with this kind of power play. Seen it a few times lately. HOA leadership gets desperate. They start making up oversight roles, printing unofficial citations, trying to strong-arm folks into compliance through confusion. Daniel felt the anger stirring again, not just at the invasion, but at how close it had come to working. Jake asked for copies of every map and filing related to subdivision H12 and the surrounding ranch properties. They loaded the truck and drove straight to a land use attorney. Daniel had hired once for a water rights issue years back. By afternoon, the attorney had reviewed everything and laid out the facts. Your land is untouchable, she said plainly. The exemption holds, and there's no legal mechanism past or present that gives that HOA a single ounce of jurisdiction over your fence, barn, or mailbox. Karen Langley and her group have no standing, no process, and no enforcement capability. They're rogue. Jake folded his arms. But they've already entered the property multiple times. One of them was arrested. Then we file civil and criminal complaints, the attorney said, opening a drawer. And we make them stick. By sunset, a cease and desist order was ready for Karen Langley and the Neighborhood Standards Committee. She'd claimed to lead. The sheriff's office was provided footage, written testimony, and verified documents of land ownership. Daniel didn't smile when he left the office. Not yet. Because deep down, he didn't believe Karen would walk away quietly. That night, Jake placed one last call to a contact in the Department of Real Estate Compliance. If there was a complaint system for rogue HOA letters, it was time to make sure it got flooded. And Daniel, as he stepped out onto his porch and watched the horizon fade, finally posted something new on the ranch's front gate. Not a threat, not a warning, just 4 words carved clean into wood. Private land. No exceptions. Karen didn't respond to the cease and desist. She didn't file a defense, didn't call Daniel, and didn't even send one of her mock enforcement letters. But that didn't mean she vanished. Instead, Daniel noticed something strange or quiet. No more SUVs pausing at the gate. No tire tracks across the grass. No envelopes, no shadows. No flashlight beams by the shed. Even the blue recycling bins that once lined the ridge road disappeared, as if the neighborhood had gone into hiding. But Daniel had lived long enough to know that silence after conflict wasn't peace. It was delay, restructuring, a pause before the next attempt. Jake stayed a few more days. In that time, he coordinated with the sheriff's office and the Department of Real Estate Compliance. Complaints were filed, reports submitted, and a full investigation was opened into the rogue HOA's behavior, including the illegal use of access keys and impersonation of governing authority. Karen's name was now part of a formal inquiry. But what finally forced her hand wasn't legal pressure. It was something much simpler. One of the other women, Deidre, the one arrested during the shed incident, broke silence. She reached out to Daniel's attorney and submitted a signed affidavit. She claimed Karen had misrepresented their group's authority, assured them the key was technically authorized, and promised they were acting in the interest of community welfare. She even admitted Karen instructed them to walk like you belong and don't answer questions. The key had come from a now retired contractor, someone Karen once dated, and the forged compliance flyers, made on her home printer, using clip art and borrowed language from real HOA bylaws in another county. With Deidre's statement, the attorney filed to move forward with civil action. Karen, faced with mounting legal pressure and county scrutiny, folded faster than anyone expected. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from her attorney, a formal apology, a commitment to never set foot on Daniel's property again, and confirmation that the Neighborhood Standards Committee had been dissolved permanently. It even included a typed letter to the county, stating that no further action would ever be taken involving Daniel's land or adjacent properties. Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or post the letter on a bulletin board. He just walked out to the gate one afternoon and removed the old private ranch "No Trespassing" sign. In its place, he bolted on a freshly carved plank, sealed in lacquer and mounted at eye level. It read, "Private property, no trespassing, no hoakaren meet la yersa camera," angled down from above. Just under the sign, in small letters barely legible, "Unless you stopped," was the final line. Smile. "You're already on camera." Jake left the next morning. Before he drove off, he stood at the gate with his father and looked over the land, quiet and wild as ever. The cattle grazed calmly, the hills stretched wide into the horizon, and the wind carried the smell of cedar and old dirt. "Still think I'm paranoid?" Daniel asked. Jake grinned. "No. Now I think you were right." Daniel didn't smile back. "Not quite." "Good. Because if Karen ever gets another idea, she won't find me alone next time." Jake glanced at the camera. "She might not find you at all. Just a courtroom." And with that, the truck rumbled down the drive, dust curling behind it like a soft curtain closing on the last act.